Afternoon and welcome. My name is Jean Ellis, and I'm a member of the Mahone Bay chapter of SCANS. First, the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is protected by the treaties of peace and friendship that did not surrender Indigenous land, resources, or sovereignty, but instead established rules for an ongoing relationship between nations. Further, we recognize and commit to addressing the need for continual engagement and learning in the spirit of peace and friendship in the work of truth and reconciliation. M'Sitnamaga, and that means all my relations. Some housekeeping. First of all, the washrooms are two sets of stairs down on the bottom. For fire escapes, you can either go the way you came in, or there's fire escape at the very end of the hall. And halfway, about an hour into the presentation, we will be having complimentary tea and coffee and cookies in the kitchen, which is down the stairs and up the other stairs. So please come. This is a free lecture, and SCANS is a welcoming organization. But we do have expenses like room rental and snacks and an honorarium and travel expenses for the lecturer. So we welcome anything you wish to give. A donation jar is located at the entrance, and it will be in the coffee room during halftime. Post-lecture video will be available at the SCANS website, www.thescans.org, and should be available by tomorrow for viewing. And as a final reminder, please make sure your phones are turned off during the presentation. Thank you, and I would like to now welcome Emily. Emily Cormier. Emily is a biologist with expertise in elasmo branch and coastal ecology. She earned her Bachelor of Science in Environmental Science, focusing on stream monitoring and nearshore fish surveys, before pursuing her passion for maritime ecosystems with the Bimini Biological Field Station Foundation, shortened for BBFSF. She completed her Master of Science in Biology at Dalhousie University in 2024 in collaboration with BBFSF. Her thesis combined satellite imagery with long-term shark survival data to investigate how changes in seagrass and mangrove habitats affect Bimini's lemon shark population. Now based in Halifax, Emily's research interests have expanded to Canadian coastal ecosystems, where she continues to advocate for shark conservation and highlight the ecological importance of species such as blue sharks, porbeagle, and dogfish. So please welcome Emily.
Thanks for the introduction. Hi, everyone. My name's Emily, as was mentioned. And today I'll be giving my presentation in two kind of parts. So the first section, which will happen before the break, is going to talk a bit more about my research specifically during my master's, some of the results that I saw, and a bit more about Bimini, the Bahamas, as you heard mentioned earlier. The second part of my presentation is where I'm going to talk a bit more generally about shark species as a whole, sharks in Nova Scotia, some identification, and that interesting shark physiology that I think you'll all find quite fascinating. So just to start with my thesis mostly. So my thesis, as is listed here, focused on the impacts of long-term habitat change on juvenile lemon sharks. So on the left is an image of Bimini. Here is the land masses shown in pale green and beige, which indicates unvegetated habitat. Then we have the aquatic ecosystem here, which shows different densities of seagrass beds, which I'll talk a bit more about later. But just as a little bit of a preview, this is kind of what the land looked like back in 1999 when we had about 42% shark survival. And then in 2017, you can see quite a stark difference in the landmass here, where a lot of those mangroves and vegetation was lost. And then in that year, we only had 32% shark survival, so quite a large decrease in that time period. But I'll talk more about why that is and what my research found throughout these slides. Am I good standing here for the camera and everything? Okay, I think I was out of the screen a little bit. Okay. So I'll start off just giving an overview of elasmobranchs and space use. and define what an elasmobranch really is. Then I'll go into my work specifically and the shark nursery in Bimini, talk about the satellite technology that I used for mapping the habitat in Bimini, and then finally the coastal development impacts, which I gave you a bit of a preview on just now. So just a brief overview of my career journey. I did start in terrestrial ecology and some aquatic ecology, mostly landlocked. But what I've really always been interested in is the Maritimes, and not the Maritimes specifically, but just ocean research in general. And as soon as I really met a shark in the water, I thought, well, that's it. Like, I have to study sharks. They're so exciting. Here's some diving that I did. In Bimini, they have a hammerhead shark dive. And so you can just go and sit on the bottom and have these sharks kind of like swim over your head for like probably around half an hour. You're just sitting there and it's just so amazing. It's really amazing to me and shocking how like calm they are too. It's not at all like you see in imagery where they're kind of thrashing around and looking for things. Like sharks in reality are quite peaceful and they kind of glide through the water and pass by you and they're very curious. So anyways, I'll talk more about that in my second presentation, which overviews a bit of general shark biology and ecology. But for now, I'll just talk about the habitat use of sharks. So greater than 25% of elasmobranchs are actually listed on the IUCN Red List. If you're familiar with the Red List, this lists species as either at risk, vulnerable to extinction, endangered, and critically endangered. Once you reach critically endangered or higher than that, it's high risk of extinction within our lifetimes, essentially, unless if there's something that's done about it. So greater than 25% of elasmobranchs are somewhere in that scale. So they're somewhere between the range of at risk or just vulnerable, where there's a potential for them to reach levels of extinction, and critically endangered. 30% of those at-risk species, their main threat is habitat degradation. So it's important to protect their critical habitat, especially for species that are coastal, where we have a lot of interactions with them as humans, where we have our properties directly on the coastline. That's where we're going to have more of an impact, especially for these species that rely on that coastal habitat for really distinctive life stages. So a bit more about the specific habitats these sharks use and the timescales at which they use the habitats. The first reason why they might use a specific area is alimentary or food-driven habitat use. And so that could be essentially if the shark knows that their prey is in that area, like this tiger shark where it's cruising over these very dense seagrass beds. This would be in like Florida or somewhere much warmer water than what we have here. They know that the turtles are feeding on seagrass, and so you'll find tiger sharks in seagrass. The second reason for habitat use is gametic or reproductive. So the sharks might go to a specific area in order to breed because they know that that's where other sharks meet up, that's where the conditions are right, and they'll return there every year to breed again. This is just a couple of Port Jackson sharks, quite interesting sharks. And this is them like copulating. So you can see the one shark will bite onto the other one to kind of get a grasp. It's hard to hold on otherwise because you're in floating water the whole time. Another reason why they might be in a specific area is for climatic reasons. So blue shark, for example, will go to specific water depths where they know the temperature is at a good level for them. Sharks aren't able to thermoregulate very well. So most sharks can't increase their body temperature at all. So they're not warm-blooded like we are. So they have to move into the water where they find temperatures that are suitable to them. This is why a lot of sharks migrate as well across huge stretches of ocean, is because they're searching for that correct water temperature for them to live in. And another reason might be as using certain habitat as a refuge. So predator avoidance. One of the biggest predators of sharks is other larger sharks. Even juvenile sharks will be preyed on by older sharks of the same species. So this shark here is a juvenile bull shark. I think they're quite cute because they have quite small little eyes, and they're a little bit, rounder and wider than some other shark species. But this one was unfortunately caught by a human, but it was using these mangrove areas where it's very shallow water where those larger sharks can't get into. And so it's safe from those larger predators. They'll also use their habitat over different time scales. So it could be as short as minutes or hours of a day. Here there's a hammerhead shark in really shallow water, so it's not going to be residing there for very long. But in this case, it's they'll often chase small fish like up against the shore to be able to catch them. Some sharks will also follow a lunar cycle. This is more prey driven for the large basking shark, which is a filter feeder. Their prey will often follow lunar or tidal cycles, and so they will also follow the tidal cycles to follow their prey. And then it could be on larger time scales, like annual or interannual, and it could be ontogenetic habitat use. So ontogenetic is where they'll use a habitat for a specific life stage. Annual or interannual is kind of what I was talking about before, where they'll come back every year at the same time because they know that there's either other sharks there or they know that it's a good temperature for the sharks to live in or for their babies to be born into. And this brings me to a very specific type of habitat, which is a nursery area. I did have a video for this here, which I'm not sure if it'll work or not, but regardless, these are small sharks that I am blanking on the name on right now, but they live off the deep sea in Ireland. So they actually were doing a roving expedition where they have a large submarine that's taking imagery of any species they could find in the bottom. And they just happened to find like hundreds of these sharks along the bottom, hundreds of egg cases, like all in a pile. And so even though it seems like quite a barren habitat where you wouldn't necessarily expect a nursery or an area for young, it actually works out perfectly because it's dark and there's a lack of predators in that area. And it's also it's the correct temperature for those young to grow up in and be able to progress into later life stages. So I think we'll probably not worry about trying to play that video so we don't have to get out.
If we click the picture, it should run.
If you click Control click, it should run, but it will open it into another window. So I don't know if you want to do that or not. It's okay if it's not working. We can always just look at the picture. Or I could even go back afterwards or at the break. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, perfect. That's what I was thinking. Okay, great. Well, if you stay at intermission and after you get your coffee, you can come back and watch some sharks swim around. So yeah, so nursery areas, that's the main point that I want to move on to now. A nursery area is usually defined, and it has to be specifically defined in order to actually be categorized as a critical habitat. And the three criteria it has to meet are that sharks are more commonly encountered there than other areas, which makes sense. Second category is that they have to have a tendency to return or remain in that area for extended periods. So if you find a lot of juvenile sharks or baby sharks that are moving through one area, that's not necessarily a nursery area unless if they're specifically staying in that location for a long time. And then the third criteria is that they'll repeatedly use that habitat across years. So it's not a one-off time that maybe the sharks were born in that spot by accident. It's actually chosen by the mother, and they'll continue to return to that spot. One really interesting behavior that sharks show is philopatry. So philopatry is the tendency for an animal to return or stay in a specific area. And lemon sharks, which I'll talk about today, actually exhibit natal philopatry. So similar to turtles, where they'll be born on a specific beach and then return there to lay their eggs. Sharks actually do the same thing. So in Bimini, they'll actually return back to Bimini, and they've recaught, because we have such a long-term data set, they've recaught the adult female sharks that they caught as young and coming back to give birth. So it's quite remarkable. And these areas are quite critical to their habitat as well. So the specific nursery area I'll talk about today is in Bimini, which you'll probably get tired of me hearing me say Bimini over and over. It's quite close to Miami, so it's only 85 kilometers east. Here's Miami, Florida. Here's Bimini. It's a very small island. It's mostly dominated by shallow tidal flats and mangrove ecosystems and seagrass. The one thing that makes Bimini really important refuge for sharks in general is that it's east of the Gulf Stream, and it's this very shallow area. So a lot of nutrients are upwelled into that shallow area, and it provides a lot of food for sharks. Sharks also use the Gulf Stream as a migratory pathway, and so they come through that area quite often. They can kind of use Bimini as a stopover to get food, to rest, and get ready for a further journey. In Bimini, the juveniles will spend their first 3 years in the nursery. So this is a juvenile lemon shark here. And they'll actually spend most of their time in the mangroves amongst like the roots of the mangrove systems where they're protected from predators. There's two main nurseries in Bimini. There's the North Sound Nursery and then the Sharkland Nursery. So the North Sound is very shallow, less than a meter deep. And it has this fringing mangrove ecosystem on the eastern shore. While Sharkland is quite a bit deeper in some spots, so the sharks tend to stay much closer to the shoreline, but also they can have this whole mangrove ecosystem that they can swim into and hide in as well, especially at the younger life stages. So like I mentioned, these habitats provide protection from larger sharks, including larger lemon sharks, which will prey upon the juveniles, but also the blacktip sharks. There's also bull sharks in Bimini, and tiger sharks as well that might prey upon them. The habitat in these areas is also quite important. So they have the mangroves, which I've mentioned multiple times, but there's also the seagrass habitat. So like in that photo of the tiger shark swimming over the seagrass bed, that seagrass is quite important for juvenile fish as well, and other small invertebrates, which will then feed the fish, which then feed the sharks. So it's important habitat for their prey, which means that the lemon sharks want to be there to eat as well, and allows them for them to grow within their first few years of their life. This is a really remarkable example of a photo of a lemon shark being born. So it's really, really rare. So they'd actually caught the shark to tag it. And then as they were tagging it, they realized that in the cloacal opening of the shark, that there was a small head of a shark peeking out. So they released it immediately and then got into the water to film this. So this is this shark's essentially first breath in a way. It's just coming out of its mom, and it's still attached by an umbilical cord. So I'll talk a bit about reproductive strategies of sharks in a bit. But one of the things you might not know is that sharks can actually have a belly button. So not quite like ours, of course, but they will have like a small, like here where this detaches, there will actually be a very small slit. And so that's one of the ways that we use to age the sharks and tell how old they are. If we catch a small shark and it still has that slit, that means that it was born within the last year, essentially. So that'll heal up eventually and disappear, but the very young ones have belly buttons in a way. Now, unfortunately, the reason why we're studying the habitat in this area is because there's been a lot of change over the past couple of decades, especially in and around the nursery areas for these sharks. So just like I mentioned earlier, there's the North Sound and the Sharkland Nursery. And these outline some of the developments that have happened over the past, which I'll go over in a bit of a timeline. So the first major development happened in 2001. This is all primarily for resort and vacation properties. This is they dredged a deep channel for boats to be able to pass further up into the lagoon, where, as I mentioned, was quite shallow. And they also started building some land masses to be able to construct on top of. Then in 2005 was when the largest areas of mangrove and other vegetation was removed. And you can see here where the landmass used to be. So there's a bit of an edge left on it. And this is one patch of mangroves that was not touched at that point. That mangrove's now gone. And you can see the complete loss of vegetation from that area. And then most recently, here's an aerial image from 2017 that I actually took from a plane. It had larger land masses that have been constructed. This is the section here. So in 2005, this is the same section here that's now been greatly expanded. And a lot of the coastline has been totally removed of vegetation and now armored. And here's an overview image in 2020 where you can start to see some of these rental and vacation properties being built on that land. So a lot of the coastline moved from having this very continuous mangrove, and now you can kind of see the characteristics that would make this good for hiding for those juvenile sharks. They have a lot of really long roots. It's very shallow. And if you're under the water, you actually can see through the entire mangrove forest. And so the sharks can move between that. Yep. Okay. So someone just asked how big the sharks are when they're juvenile and when they're born. What's the length? They can be quite small. So they're usually around 60 centimeters or so. So quite tiny. And the adults will then reach up to 1.4 meters in length or even longer for the lemon sharks at least. But it ranges a lot depending on what shark it is. But yeah, so these ones are about 60 centimeters. So roughly around this size. Yeah, so this is kind of what the intact coastline would naturally look like. And then this is what it's changed to now. So quite dramatic. This is a photo that I took in 2023, actually. It almost looks like it's AI, I find, because it's so starkly, everything's so square and perfect. Yeah, so you can see how this doesn't provide any kind of habitat at this point. There's nothing here. And obviously, to make it so that boats could get into the area to then dock next to these properties, they've also dredged quite deep channels here. Yeah. So not only does that remove the habitat, but it also allows for larger sharks to then now start coming up into these shallow areas because they're able to use this as a passageway to get closer to the shallow mangrove and seagrass. Now, despite seeing this stark change, there was no real scientific evidence showing that there was an impact of this change on the sharks over time. And so that was partly due to a lack of habitat data. A lot of the time, you're not collecting baseline data. Baseline data is so important in science, but a lot of the time you don't know to collect that data until after something happens. And then you realize, well, now I can't prove that something was the way it was before because we didn't collect anything. So that's what my project aimed to do, was to map the distribution of seagrass and mangrove over time and then relate that habitat change to lemon shark survival over the same time frame. And we did that using satellite remote sensing primarily. So this is a NASA satellite that's floating over the Earth's surface. These satellites have been running for decades. The first satellite was released, first satellite was released in 1984 and ran until 2011, and then new satellites were launched over time to have a continuous data set of imagery available. The way that the satellite imagery works is that they take a picture as they're going around the Earth continuously, and that picture is categorized into different light bandwidths. So they would take one photo and separate all of the red light from that photo, all of the green light, all of the blue light. And then you can look at how much red is reflected by an image, how much green is reflected, and how much blue is reflected, and kind of use that to categorize what might be in each pixel of the image. So I'll go through an example here. This is one satellite image of Bimini. This is Bimini here, again, quite small. So if we zoom in here, you can see the land that I was showing you before, and this is the aquatic habitat here, and then all of this very shallow, sandy, tidal area. So my project was focusing primarily on this landmass here. So I'll zoom in a bit further, and now you can start to see more of the pixelation of this image. So the pixels for NASA's Landsat satellites, are quite large, well, small, but large at the same time. They're about 30 meters by 30 meters square. So that's how much you can categorize at a time. That's just one of the drawbacks of using free satellite imagery versus some of the higher resolution satellites. You can get down to 1 meter resolution or even smaller. Anyway, so as we zoom in here, now that we can really see the pixel level at this point, you can really see the difference in colors of those pixels as well. We can start to kind of imagine how a mapping exercise would work for these. So what I would do is look at a picture like this and say, okay, well, I've been there and I know that this pixel specifically is seagrass habitat. This pixel is mangrove and this pixel is land. So I'll put points down and say this is land, this is seagrass, and then the model will look at, okay, well, for those points, what does the reflectance look like? How much red light is reflected versus green or blue? And it'll come up with amounts for each of those bandwidths. So what I was primarily using was red light, green light, blue, and near infrared. So near infrared is a special type of light that we can't see, but that plants reflect exclusively. Or not exclusively, but they do reflect a lot of it compared to other land types. So here in the mangrove, we see a lot of near infrared and a lot of green, which you might expect. Whereas with the seagrass, we don't see any near infrared because it's water, so near infrared light won't pass through water. And so that's one of the ways that we can at least separate the land mass from the water in these images. Yeah. So this method is called machine learning random forest models. And that's essentially where you're taking the image, you give it coordinates that you know are certain habitats, and then it uses those to predict what habitats there are in all of the unknown pixels where you haven't told it exactly what's there. And this is a bit technical, but what I was using for my project is a program called, or not a program, but a model called the Automatic Adaptive Signature Generalization Algorithm. Quite a mouthful. All it needs is 1 year of in situ data. So in situ is data that was collected on the ground that you know, okay, for sure this is mangrove versus seagrass. And then it will use that to map the years without in situ data. So it'll calculate the standard deviation of one band for each habitat type. So for example, if we had mangrove, a mangrove pixel, we looked at the amount of green light reflected by all of the mangrove pixels in the image that I told it were mangrove. It calculates the standard deviation of that color band and then looks at an unknown pixel and says, okay, well, does that color band fit within that same standard deviation? If it does, then it would classify it as a mangrove habitat as well. So a general overview of how this would work is I have my one satellite image from the USGS. I then use a land mask, which separates the terrestrial from the aquatic habitat because they can't be categorized in the same way, as I mentioned earlier, with the near infrared light reflectance differing in those two habitats. And then I'll use my random forest classification where I'm telling it what points are in which locations to create my two initial maps. And so those are my training data for my automatic adaptive signature generalization algorithm. And then I take those maps, put it into the AASG algorithm, and create 18 years of maps over the entire time period that we have imagery available, within limitation, of course. The one thing you have to watch out for is sometimes with satellite imagery, it gets covered by clouds. So you can't define those ones, of course. But for the most part, we were able to map in every year from 1999 until 2020, the habitat that was present there. And then we could combine that all to get our general overview. And then once we have those maps across time, we can calculate how much of each habitat type was available in each time period, and then look at trends. So first I'll show you what our maps looked like. I talked a bit about this before, but now I'll go over how it changed from 1999 to 2017. So in 1999, we have, here is the vegetated terrestrial. Unvegetated terrestrial habitat is here in beige. We have high density seagrasses in dark green. Mid density seagrasses is kind of aqua color. And then barren or low density seagrass, so that could either be sand or it's very few blades of seagrass present, is this really pale blue color. So in 1999, we had in here quite a bit of dense seagrass as well as mid-density seagrass. But then when we move forward to 2001, when I mentioned we had that first dredging, that first channel that was dredged, we can see a lot of that seagrass disappeared. And that's expected, right? Because we have the dredged channel, there's not going to be seagrass in that dredged channel. So that's why it appears as the low density seagrass. But what's also interesting is that adjacent to the dredged channel, you can also see an area of low density seagrass appear. So if I go back to the map previous, you can see there's like quite high and mid density, and then you move forward and you have a low density patch directly adjacent to the dredging. So that's possibly, we don't know for sure because we weren't able to collect data directly on at the location during that time period, but it's possible that from when they're dredging, the silt and sediment kind of gets moved up into the water column, that's picked up by currents and is deposited on nearby seagrass beds. So then the other, sneak preview. The other main change that we saw was that mangrove removal in 2005. So here's an image from 2002 where you see those intact mangroves. And then I want to bring your attention again to the adjacent seagrass beds further south and up into this portion. And then when we move into 2006, we see a clear loss of vegetation, but we also see a possible change in seagrass density adjacent to that seagrass or the terrestrial vegetation loss and removal. So I'll go back again so you can see that. So we have quite a bit of like mid-density seagrass here and some high density. And then a lot of it transforms into mid-density seagrass up here, and we have lower density up north as well. The important thing to note with seagrass is that it does change interannually. So from year to year, like the seagrass that we even have offshore in Nova Scotia, the density will decrease in the winter and then come back in the summer. So you will see some changes normally between different years. So that not every patch of seagrass is going to be the exact same from one year to the next. The thing that makes these stand out is that when we looked across all of time, this area especially was almost always habited by mid or high density seagrass, but in the years after vegetation removal, there was hardly any vegetation at all. So that's where we have this last island creation in this northern part, where I showed you those overhead aerial images. And now there's really no high density seagrass in that area adjacent to that change. And then here's an aerial image again of what that looks like. And you can see again the very deep channels. And some of the high density seagrass is present along this coastline. So not as much here, this is pretty low density, but around here there's some high density seagrass. And then you see some of this mid density seagrass. And some of the high density has actually rebounded in some areas by 2021, but it's not to the extent of what it was previously, at least from what we see from our maps. So once we actually calculated and measured the amount of seagrass per year, we could look at the trends over time. So on the x-axis here, we have the year, so starting from 1999 to 2022. And then on the y-axis, we have the number of hectares of the vegetated, and the barren is the unvegetated habitat, so where the vegetation's been removed. This is just for the North Sound Nursery, so we're looking at this top portion here. So again, we saw this decline in vegetation from 2004 to 2009, but then importantly, we saw an increase in barren habitat extent from 2015 to 2017. So not only is the vegetation being removed, but new land is actually being created in the lagoon ecosystem for further construction. And then if we compare that to the seagrass extent, we see a general decline in seagrass from 2004 to 2009, but what we also see is actually a rapid rebound in seagrass extent after this time period. So seagrass is quite resilient, so it is able to come back in some cases. What we don't know is if the same species of seagrass came back in that area, because certain species have higher resilience to change than others. And so the species composition could have still changed even if there is seagrass present again. And then if we look at that time period where the islands were created, we see a really sharp decline in seagrass extent directly after vegetation removal or the island creation, that northern part. And then it starts to gradually rebound, so it is coming back slowly over time. But again, we don't know if that's the same species or not. And the importance of that is that certain species have different lengths, they have different root systems, so they'll hold the sediment at different ways, and they provide different habitat for species. So it could be changing things in ways that we're not necessarily able to measure with just raw extent or density measurements. So now how does this actually relate to sharks? I know that's probably maybe the more exciting part of my presentation. But the handy thing about working with the Bimini Shark Lab is they've actually been tagging sharks for decades as well. So we have a really long-term data set of those juvenile sharks. So the sharks will pup consistently between May and June. So all of the female lemon sharks will come up during that time period. They'll actually come up into the lagoon. So that picture I showed you where it was giving birth, you could see how shallow that water was. They'll come up in times where their stomach is touching the bottom of the water column. But they'll always come back to that same spot. And because of this consistent pupping time period and the fact that these sharks remain in the nursery for 3 years, we're able to go out and capture these sharks and actually tag each one of them, give them an individual ID. And then if we recapture it, we'll know when that shark was born, how long it's lived. The other thing that allows us to calculate the survival of these sharks is that the recapture rate is very high. So even up to age 2, you're recatching almost all of the sharks that were born in that area. And so that allows you to estimate that if there are individuals that are missing, it's likely that they did pass away and they weren't recaught. And so this annual mark recapture survey has been completed since 1995. So you can estimate every year how many sharks are surviving during that time period. On the right are some images of how the actual tagging happens. So what the Shark Lab will do, it's not running right now, but when it was running, what the Shark Lab would do is you go out all hours of the day, essentially for 4 days, and you set up a net and you catch every shark that swims into this net. Once you catch the shark, you put it into a tub. Well, first you'll put it somewhere so that it rests, so it's not as stressed when you're tagging it. But then you'll take that shark out of the pen where you have it for holding and tag it with a pit tag. So it's a passive integrated transponder. So these tags, you have to have a scanner that you put over top of the shark, and then it'll tell you what the ID is on that tag, similar to what you would have in your pet. Yes, and then all of the sharks that we capture are all kept in the pen until all of the surveys are completed. And then once they're completed, we'll release them all back where they were caught. And so in that way, you're kind of doing a mark depletion experiment where you're continually catching the sharks in the lagoon. And so by the time you're done the captures, you know that you've caught all of the sharks that were in the lagoon at that time, or the majority of them at least.
So Emily, it
Yeah.
looks pretty simple to tag a small shark, but if
Yes.
it's like 1.5 to 2 meters, what does that process look like? Because it wouldn't be that.
No, it wouldn't be this. I mean, you can pit tag larger sharks as well. You can put small tags in them also, but it is very different, like the way that you capture and hold them during that tagging experience. And I will talk about that later. So if you want to wait till the second part, then I'll chat a bit about that. But you're right, it's very different from this. You can't just hold them and
So this
tag
is
them.
juvenile, not the adult.
Just the juveniles, yeah. Yeah, so this is just the juvenile sharks that are in this nursery. This tagging doesn't capture the larger sharks. I mean, it does. There's occasions where they've caught 1 meter long lemon sharks, but we don't keep them at that point. We just let them go because in the way that we're tagging these, we don't have the capacity to tag the larger sharks at that time.
So what is the normal lifespan of these sharks?
That's a great question. And actually, I can't remember off the top of my head, but I will look that up again and I can confirm with you at the break if that works. They have quite long lifespans. I want to say that it's at least over 10 years, but I don't want to tell you the wrong number, so I'll look that up again. Thank you. So now I'm going to get a bit into the stats of what I did with this tagging data that we had from our long-term data set. And the 2 main response variables, so this is the variables I was looking at to see if they changed over time with the other impacts, were survival. So was the shark recaught? Then it survived. If it wasn't recaught, then we assumed that it had died. And that's because of our high recapture rates and the fact that we know that the sharks stay in the nursery up until age 2 at least. And the other factor I was looking at is how much the shark had grown. So had it grown more or less in certain years from 1 year to the next. And I was looking specifically just at how much it had grown from age 0 to age 1. PCL is the pre-caudal length. So this is the caudal fin of the shark. The pre-caudal length would be measured from the nose all the way to just here. And that gives you a good estimate of the size of the shark, but then also controls for changes that might happen in the tail morphology. And a lot of the growth in the first few years does happen in the general body of the shark versus the tail. And in a general range, a shark will grow between 0.7 to 15 centimeters a year. So it really depends on the individual. But the average that we had in our data set was about 5 centimeters per year is what was expected. It is a pretty large range. It really depends on the individual, and they have really variable behavioral traits depending on the individual. Some are much more exploratory, and there's a lot of papers looking at the trade-off between exploration versus staying in safer areas for growth and survival. This is a bit of a side tangent, but the Some sharks that move out further and are more exploratory, so they're able to find more food, in theory, they're kind of trading that off for risk of predation. So some of the sharks that move out and further will have higher risk of predation, so they might have lower survival, but those individuals that do survive are growing faster than individuals that are staying safer and closer in those shallow areas. They might have much lower growth because they are not getting as much food, but they're also more likely to survive. Yeah, so that's why you might see more of a range, is because each individual actually has its own behavior as well. Yeah. That would be a thing I have to look up as well. I never studied the male-female disparity in Bimini, at least. That's something that would occur further offshore once they've gotten to larger sizes. So I would have to look into that. I don't want to give you an incorrect answer for that as well. So, yeah. Oh, sure. Sorry. The first question was, it seemed like a very large range between 0.7 and 15 centimeters growth. And the second question that I was answering was if there was a difference between male and female for how large they were growing or how fast they were growing over time. So I took these response variables, the survival and the growth of the sharks over time, and I put them into a generalized linear mix model and a growth generalized linear mix model. This will come into play when I'm explaining the stats results. The first model had to be a binomial distribution. That's because we only had ones or zeros, so whether the shark survived or didn't. Whereas with the growth model, it was a Gaussian distribution, which is normally distributed, where you have a range from 0 to 15 was the range that we had. But you'll see kind of a curve of sizes or growths in that range. Then we had our predictor variables. So the predictor variables were being used to assess the factors that might impact the growth or the survival. So we had some population level variables. So that was the proportion of sharks in that year that were born or that were caught, which were age 0. So if you have more very young sharks born in that year, it's possible that there's more competition between those juveniles. It's possible that there's less predation on them from the larger juvenile size classes. As well as the number of sharks caught, that also works into competition, where if you have more sharks born in that year, then there will be higher competition for food and resources. And then we also looked at what net the shark was caught in. So for these surveys, we set up 6 different nets in 6 different locations. We had some in the North Sound nursery, where there's one closest to development, and then 2 that are closer to the mangrove edge. And then we had 3 in Sharkland dispersed along that coastline. We then looked at individual level variables, so what age the shark was during that year, if it was age 0 or age 1. Age 0 would be 1 or less, essentially, so where we had that open umbilical scar. And then the length of that shark, which I talked a bit about earlier. The other variables we looked at, which is what we were really interested in, was the habitat extent per net. So what did the coastline look like closest to the net where they were captured? Was it mostly vegetated or was it unvegetated? And then we looked at the amount of habitat change from one year to the next. So from the year that shark was caught and then recaught, during that time period, how much seagrass was lost, how much mangrove vegetation was lost. And then here are some of our results for that. I'll explain a bit about how to interpret these first before I go over all of them. So these are the variables that I was looking at. So the age of the shark, body length, number of sharks caught. This is the results of the model. So here on the survival side of things, that's the binomial model, which I mentioned earlier. So it's being measured on a proportion. So we have here where it's 1.5, that means that it had a 0.5 greater survival or possibility of survival over the average, which would have just been 1. So if it's a value of 1, there's no impact. If it's greater or less than that, there is an impact. So here we have 1.5. So the 0.5 indicates that there's a 51% greater chance of survival for sharks that are age 1, so of the greater age class. For body length, we see 0.9. So this actually means that the larger the shark was, the lower the survival was. And so that kind of plays into what I was talking about before, where the larger sharks are often larger because they are more exploratory and they're getting more food, but there's a higher risk of predation. The other thing we have to consider is that the larger sharks might be moving out further, and so they might not be captured by the nets as much as the smaller sharks that are staying in close to the nursery. And then we have the number of sharks caught here, so that also showed a negative impact on survival. So where it's very small. At this point, it's 0.01, is 0.004% increased chance of survival. So it's not a large increase, but it did show that it was a significant effect in the model. So there might be some small impact of having more sharks caught in a year that would decrease the chance of survival for those sharks. Oh, I just went over those. I should have gone through my handy little notes. But yeah, so that's just what I was talking about there, where we have the less than 1% decrease in survival with the number of sharks caught, but it was still significant. When we look at the growth coefficients, so how much these variables impacted the growth of the sharks, we see that so this is a different metric. So if it's positive, it's positive. So 0.6 means a 0.6 increase in growth. So those sharks would have I believe it was 0.60 centimeter increase in growth, or sorry, 0.6 centimeter increase in growth for every centimeter of body length that they were larger, which we would expect because larger sharks would have grown more in the year previous. And then the number of sharks caught had a slight decrease in growth as well. Still pretty small decrease overall. And the reason that we included these variables, even if, like say, body length is not impacting growth that much, we still want to include it into our model because we're then controlling for that variable. So that if we're seeing changes related to the vegetation, then we know it's not just because that shark was bigger that it survived less or grew more. So now we know that we've controlled for that possible effect as well. So now getting into some of the habitat effects. So the main thing here is the impact of coastal development. That was the only habitat effect that we found significantly affected the shark growth or survival. So the other variables I was talking about with the amount of change in a year or the extent of seagrass habitat were not shown to be significantly affecting the survival or the growth. But the amount of coastal development, so that means the amount of change in the coastline specifically, so the amount of mangrove removed, did have a significant effect on survival. So with coastal development increasing, the survival decreased in those years for the sharks that were present. So here on this plot, we have the predicted probability of survival on the y-axis, going from about 10 to 40%. The regular percent chance of survival is around 40, so that's usually what we would expect for the population. And as we increase the amount of coastal development that's occurring, so this is the percentage of the total coastline on the x-axis. Here we have 50% of the total coastline being developed in 1 year. This is just predicted, so that we didn't see up to 50%, but, well, actually we did in some coastlines, but this is the predicted probability based on the model that we had created. And you can see a fairly clear trend of decreased survival with that increased construction. We also found something interesting, that the net that the shark was caught in, so the location where it was in theory residing, significantly impacted their survival. So on the eastern side, where there was less development, we saw survivals in the range of 46% survival of those individuals from 1 year to the next. Whereas on the western side, closest to this development, we only saw 29% survival, so quite a bit lower. And one of the reasons why that may not have shown up in the model is because there's many other variables and factors impacting sharks during the coastal development phase that we may not have been able to account for. So things like pollution, increased algae blooms potentially when they're fertilizing those lawns that they're now growing in sand habitats. Noise has also been shown to impact shark movement in some cases, and so there's going to be a lot of noise from construction as well in those areas. And then the prey and predator dynamic. So whether the fish species are moving out of that area, if they're impacted by the coastal development, then those sharks will also be impacted in that way. So why is this important? One of the reasons why I was so interested in this is because even when I was in Bimini during the few years that I volunteered there, like over time, I even saw a lot of changes. So in the year that I first started, this area wasn't developed at all. And to then go up there in a vessel and actually see how like all of the vegetation gone was really shocking and kind of made me want to look into this more and actually try to prove something about the impacts of this vegetation loss. And one of the important things about this coastal development is that there's more planned for the near future, like really near future. This came out last year, this image. There's a whole website now for new developments that they're planning in the mangrove areas and around them, directly in the nursery of these lemon sharks. They're currently planning to develop about 750 acres of land, which is huge for such a small area, and that's another 3 kilometers of coastline. So here's what it looks like today. And again, this development along that coastline. You can see the armored wall along the edge here. This is their development plan. So it looks fairly green, but this is a large golf course. And there's little tiki huts that they've put along the edge of the coastline here too. And they're actually planning to put, you can't really see it that well, but there's a pathway here that goes through the mangrove. So they're actually touting this as an eco resort online. The problem with that is, like I was mentioning, how the years where the coastal development happened is where we saw the real impact on the shark species. And so even if maybe once this is built, like these tiki huts might not have a huge impact because they're over the water. But to be able to get construction equipment in there, to be able to actually build on this land, to be able to actually get these pathways in on this really, really marshy area, like this is mostly water and trees and those mangroves I was mentioning before, that's going to have a huge impact regardless of what it looks like in the future. And so this is the future extent, which is 40% of the North Sound coastline. So that shark nursery I mentioned, which is primarily in this area here. And so as I mentioned before, with the increase in coastal development, we saw a 2% decrease in survival probability of the sharks during that year. So if a further 40% of the coast was developed, that could result in an 80% decrease in survival. Of course, that's if the development happens in 1 year, which it probably won't. But I think this really highlights the impact that removing that amount of vegetation or developing on that coastline could have, at least on a few generations of sharks. And this would result in a 100% loss of vegetation along the coastline. Again, I'm not sure exactly what they're planning on developing these areas, but based on their previous development history, it doesn't look like it would be natural shorelines and mangrove vegetation that would be left over. And this really, yeah.
Coastal development be representative of the other islands in the Caribbean?
It would depend on which one. I mean, a lot of Caribbean islands do have coastlines that are developed and armored along the walls or along the shoreline. So yeah, you do see a lot of it in other areas. The question for that one was just if this kind of development is reflective of other areas in the Caribbean as well. Was there another question? Yeah.
It makes me want to see a big storm come through and wipe that all out.
Yeah, right.
But
yeah,
when you were monitoring, was there any major storm events?
So the question was if during the time that I was monitoring, if there were any major storm events. There wasn't. There were quite a few hurricanes that went nearby Bimini. And I looked into, I think there was one hurricane that did actually pass really close by, but it didn't have any major impacts on the vegetation in that area. So it wouldn't have, like I looked into that as a factor influencing the change in the seagrass habitat as well. But it wasn't the type of storm that would have like really changed the vegetation to an extent that we were seeing. Yeah. It was running, so the satellite imagery, sorry, the question was how long was the study for? So the satellite imagery was from 1995 to 2020. And the tagging data was from also the same time frame because I was trying to fit the data to each other. Yeah. Yeah. The question was whether there was any environmental planning in the Bahamas, because there are some in other Caribbean countries as well, and environmental impacts assessments. So there was actually an environmental impact assessment done in Bimini in around 2008. They came to review the construction that was currently ongoing, and they said that there was an inadequate use of silt curtains. So that's the curtains that they would put up to block sediment from moving into other areas of the lagoon. And that there was large improvements they could make to the environmental responsibility of the construction that was occurring. Nothing happened with that I know of. There's quite a bit of contention over this area of Bimini. A lot of environmental and local organizations there are fighting to keep this natural. But the government is getting a lot of money from these international organizations to purchase the land and be able to construct on it. At one point, this was supposed to be allotted as a marine protected area, and it was slotted to be put into legislation at some point, but that document was never signed. So it's, yeah. Not that I know of. Yeah. Yeah.
Is there any hope that your research will impact or influence the development in the Bimini area?
So the question was whether there's hope that my research will have an impact on the development in the Bimini area. I don't know that my research alone will change anything necessarily, but there's a lot of on-the-ground organizations and local people that are fighting for protection of these areas. And I think that my research could be a tool for them to use to show the impact of development, at least on some of the local residents, like the fish and the sharks. Another important industry, not necessarily an industry because it's pretty small, but a tourism factor for people going to Bimini is bone fishing. So bonefish are quite large and they really put up a good fight when you're fishing for them. They really rely on these mangrove areas. We would accidentally end up catching them in our nets quite often when we were catching the lemon sharks and have to release them. But those as well would be impacted by the coastline removal. We didn't study them specifically, so we don't know exactly how, but a lot of the locals that are running bone fishing tours are worried about how this loss of mangroves would impact their livelihood and whether they would have access to these areas as well. There's an area further south on Bimini Island. Actually, maybe I'll move to the, anyways, I'll show you on another map, but there's an area on the southern portion of Bimini Island that's, it's not called South Island, but anyways, I'll show you on a map in a second. But all of the local people kind of live in that stretch of land. And as you're driving up the road, there's only 2 roads in Bimini because it's very small. As you're driving up the road, you'll pass a gateway, which goes into the tourist zone and all of these resort communities. And you can just see like the change in the people that are there, the security that's around, the types of vehicles that you see. Like the local people really don't have access to that part of the island anymore. And that's like my concern, and the local people's concern too, is how is water access going to change if there's a lot of development along these areas? And now you have tourists coming in that maybe want to be separated from the local communities that are living there. Yeah, so the main takeaways from my study was that the algorithm I mentioned was really useful for mapping over long term. So I'm hoping that other researchers will also use this method for mapping in other areas where we don't necessarily have baseline data and that where there is really rapid change happening. The coastal development did impact both the North Sound and Lemon Shark, the Sharkland nurseries. And this really enforces the importance of protecting and mitigating the impacts of construction. In a lot of these places, you can't really stop coastal development, but at least if it was done responsibly in a way that was taking into consideration the ecosystem, then we could hope to have the least impact possible, and in consultation with the local people, which right now is not really taking place. Yeah, so just want to acknowledge everyone that helped with this project. And I'll show you on the map what I was talking about earlier. So up here is where I was showing a lot of the resort development that was occurring. This is the portion where the majority of Bimini, like local Bimini people live, is in this part of the island. And then there's a gateway, I think, like around here. It's not locked. It's just a big archway, but it just really provides a stark contrast for the difference between the two areas. Yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say on that. Yeah, and this work really wouldn't be possible without the tireless work of all of the interns and staff over the decades of research that have happened at the Bimini Biological Field Station. So I have a lot of people to thank for this data being available. And if you want to help or you're interested in learning more, last time I checked, this Instagram page was still running. That's the Instagram page being run by local people trying to fight for change. Of course, the resort, you can make sure not to go to that resort. It's called Banyan Tree Bimini. And I'd also really urge like anyone, when you are going traveling in general, to really think about what measures the resort you're going to has taken to try to be as ecological as possible. In some cases, resorts have existed for decades, but it's what are they doing now to try to mitigate the impacts that they're having on the local ecosystem. And animals you might not think of, like these juvenile lemon sharks, that might be right off the doorstep of these places, but you just don't see them. Yeah. Yeah, and those are just references. So that's it for my first presentation. I guess we probably have time for questions for this first session. Yep.
As it's now a resort, has there been sort of, and they've also increased the depth there. That's obviously the larger predators, larger sharks stuff. Has there been like moves to try and stop sharks getting in and interfere with, wildlife further? And also the other side, which is the marshes.
Yes. So the question was whether with these deeper channels, if they're putting up any measures to try to stop the movement of sharks into those deeper channels that they can't predate on the juveniles, and if they've started spraying for mosquitoes or anything in those wetland areas that are quite marshy. There hasn't been any measures to try to stop the sharks moving up the channels. I think that trying to implement shark measures is going to be really difficult and maybe provide more provide more management stress on the enforcers there to try to manage that. It's kind of difficult to stop sharks from moving, and it's I think more so the impact of the loss of the smaller fish and that intact coastline for the sharks to hide in that would decrease their survival over time. We also don't want to, if those larger sharks have been feeding on the juvenile lemon sharks, even if they did so less in the past, we don't want to stop them from feeding on them altogether because that would also impact their survival over time. Right now, we don't know how many sharks are actually using that channel exactly, but we do know that they moved up that channel a bit. There's actually quite a few bull sharks that are around one of the resorts. There's like a dock, and people often like throw fish and stuff off the dock to see the bull sharks swim around, which is cool to watch. But anyways, I think there will be a lot of different impacts that we won't necessarily be able to control for all of them. In terms of the spray, I don't know of any spray that they're using specifically. There's nothing online about spray being used. I haven't really looked into it that much, to be fair, but you do notice a lot less mosquitoes when you get to the resort part of the island than when you're in the other portion. I think that has more to do, though, with the amount of vegetation that's there. like if you're on the south part of the island. So the shark lab is actually located around here. And here you can see there's like a lot of vegetation, really continuous vegetation throughout that. These are the kind of marshy mangrove areas. And when you're staying at the station, you really notice a lot of sandflies, especially, that will be biting your legs and kind of attacking you like crazy. And on our days off, we would often go up to this part of the island just to escape the bugs because they were so horrible. So I don't know why exactly there's less bugs there, but it's likely just because there's less vegetation and hopefully not because they're spraying for them. Yeah. They have a lot of different funders. Primarily, it's the Save Our Seas Foundation. So they're a foundation that mostly funds elasmobranch research worldwide. The other large funder they have is the Ocean Mokum Foundation, which is another private NGO that's just really interested in increasing shark protection. That's been funding the lab more previously. And then they have some small funders, like small grants that they apply to. So for each project, they'll apply to a different grant to be able to get funding for it. So those have been from National Geographic in some cases. They've also gotten some funding from Shark Week. So if Shark Week, there's a lot of, it's a bit problematic in some ways, but they do fund some research, especially in the past. If you were able to get to work with them, they would pay you a certain amount of money for being in their show. So that funded some, but it's a very small portion compared to how much they're getting from Save Our Seas and the Ocean Mokum Foundation. Sorry, the question for that was, where does the funding come from for the Bimini Shark Lab? Yeah, I think you had a question for a bit. The question was whether there was a development agreement to, or if part of their development agreement was to pay into a mitigation fund. Not that I'm aware of. A lot of this stuff is happening in legislation that I don't have access to. And so I don't know if they're paying into a fund necessarily. Based on what I've been seeing from the ocean mitigation that they did have, like the silt curtains that I saw, they didn't seem to be doing an adequate job at protecting the movement of sediment. And that's about all I know for how much mitigation they're required to do.
I think we better go for our coffee break because we still do have a second part.
Yes.
So as again, it's complimentary tea and coffee. Please go to the kitchen. There's cookies there as well. So help yourself.
Coming back for the second part of my presentation. This next part is more about general and physiology of sharks. And I really focus on what I find most interesting about them, because I think you will too. But there's so much that's interesting about sharks. So I wish I had hours, but anyways, I'll try to crunch it into this half an hour that we have to talk about it. And if you're interested in knowing more, I really encourage you to look into more about shark physiology and behavior, because there's lots of really good papers out there about it. So I'm not sure if we'll play this video first. And actually, I'm going to move over here. So this is the video I was talking about earlier, where it's that shark nursery that's found in the deep waters off of Ireland. And it was cat sharks that they found. And you'll see why they're called cat sharks. You probably saw in the picture I showed earlier as well. But they have these really large eyes. And the reasoning for that is that they can actually see better in the dark because they live in these really, really deep areas of the ocean. So that's all sharks. So all of these white animals moving around, those are all sharks. And the exciting part about this discovery as well, this is back in 2018, and actually I only heard of it when I was looking for interesting like shark nurseries to talk to you guys about. But they just found this as they had one of those deep sea rovers that you'll see normally getting videos of the deep sea bed. And they just happened upon this huge aggregation of these cat sharks. Sure, sorry, I should have mentioned beforehand. I'll answer this question, but we'll leave questions to the end just because we're a bit short on time. The question was, what do they eat down there? It's possible that they're not eating as much when they're down here, at least the adults, because they might be going and pupping and then leaving right away. The juveniles, though, there's a lot of like small invertebrates. There's crustaceans, there's like I'm not sure what lives down here exactly, but for other like benthic species, they would be eating like large snails and copepods and that kind of thing. So that's mostly what they would be eating while they're down there. Yeah, so maybe we'll go to the presentation since we're short on time, and yeah, I'll stop this one for now. But yeah, I can only imagine how excited they were when they actually found that, because most of the time when you're down in these deep sea expeditions, you don't really see much, maybe a few creatures here and there, but to find such a huge aggregation would have just been so astounding. I also brought, and I won't pass them around because these are quite fragile, but I brought some jaws from some local shark species we have here. So if you want to come up and take a look at them after, I'm happy to show you. And I have a few jars of some shark teeth also, and some tags that I'll talk about a bit during this presentation. So I'll just start off with what an elasmobranch is and essentially go through some fun facts about sharks. So elasmobranch stands for elasmo, which is plate. Oh, I think it's maybe going through automatically. I think the slide timing might be on if you go into the slideshow tab. Yeah, and then use timings if you uncheck that box. Yeah. I unchecked it earlier, but sometimes it just does it automatically. And you can just start on that slide again. Perfect, thanks. So elasmobranch stands for plate and gill. So that includes the sharks and the rays, and they both have gill-like plates that you can see externally. So the slits on the side is where the gills are located. Who are elasmobranchs? It's a huge, huge range and diversity of species. And I find that to be one of the most fascinating things about sharks in general, sharks and rays, is that each one of them is really uniquely adapted to the environment they live in and the prey they prey on. You may have heard the fact that sharks are as old as trees, and it's really that the chondrichthyan taxa have existed for tens of thousands of years and have survived as long as they have because they have these really unique adaptations to survive in their environment. So of course, you know the white shark, it's the most famous shark that you see the most on TV, but there's also a lot smaller species. There's the rays as well that can be quite large. And sharks that kind of look like a mix between sharks and rays. Then you have the lemon shark, which of course we talked about a lot previously. And then we have some sharks that are quite patterned and spotty and made for blending into their own environment. Some of the really unique traits that sharks have are electroreception. So here's a hammerhead shark. On this part of its cephalofoil is what it's called. They have sensory receptors to be able to detect prey that are hiding in the sand. Some sharks are able to stun their prey with their tails. So this is a thresher shark. We actually have these in Nova Scotia. They're just far offshore and not here all year round. They'll actually turn around and whip groups of fish to stun them and catch them. Some of the sharks are really adapted to survive in darkness. This is a dogfish. They also exist in Nova Scotia, but very, very deep. And they have those cat-like eyes to be able to see well in the dark. Some sharks, like this whale shark, largest fish in the world, because sharks are actually part of the fish class of animals, they feed on plankton, and they feed on very small zooplankton and invertebrates. You wouldn't tell by how large they are, but they're filter feeders. And they actually have individual spot patterns. So some of the work that I did in the past was working in the Philippines at places where they were baiting sharks for tourism. I was trying to see whether that impacted, well, with a research group, Lamave, whether that impacted their movement, if they were staying in an area longer or more or less long because they were being baited. And the way we did that was all just by looking at what spot patterns they had on them and identifying each individual that way, similar to a human fingerprint. Some of them even have external tooth structures. This is a sawfish. This is just in an aquarium, but normally you wouldn't see the bottom of a sawfish because it's constantly searching around the bottom in these really silty kind of mangrove habitats. Sawfish also exist in Bimini, though they're very rarely sighted, especially recently. But that's another species that's really sensitive to environmental change. In Nova Scotia, where it's actually home to over 120 shark species, which might sound insane, but a lot of these sharks you're not going to see because they're living very deep, far offshore. They'll be seasonal migrants. So in some cases, they've actually seen tiger sharks offshore Nova Scotia when the water's warm enough. That's been like very, very rare. They've also seen Greenland sharks. That's one of the more, it's a common species within the first top 10. And they've even seen those off of, I think the last one of my colleagues spotted one off of Chester, just swimming around like in the shallow water, just because the water happened to be cold enough for them at that time. Most commonly though, you'll see, well, maybe not everyone would see, but the most common species are the blue shark, especially. There's a lot of blue sharks in Nova Scotia. The short fin mako, which is one of the fastest sharks in the world. The poor beagle, which is a very close relative to that. The white shark, which is the most in the media. I'm sure a lot of you know that there's white sharks around. Basking shark, which is pictured here. It's similar to the whale shark in that it's also a filter feeder. So it actually just swims through the water with its mouth open, lets the water pass over its gills and captures prey that way, like very, very small prey. You can see the person here for scale. They're also this very large shark. And there's also some ray species in Nova Scotia. Some of the most common ones that are caught often in bottom trawling are the barn door skate, winter skate, and thorny skate. But a really interesting species we also have is the torpedo ray, which is shown here. And that actually can deliver an electric shock if you touch it. So it's an actual electric ray. Those are also, I mean, I dive and I try to look for them. I never see them, but I wish that I would because they look really cool. Yeah, so those are the sharks we have here. Here's some other examples of sharks that we have and just like the range of sizes and types of sharks that are present in Nova Scotia. A lot of these are the deep sea species that are really small. Like this is the adult size that you're looking at here. And then we also have the larger species. I've actually seen basking sharks before in near Cape Breton. There's an area that near the causeway where a lot of fish get trapped and there's a huge upwelling of nutrients in the fall. I was there once when there was a lot of shark activity and you could see basking shark fins like in the water as they're swimming in circles, like catching filter feeding, but I haven't seen it since, so I haven't been doing my timing right, I guess. So that brings me to one interesting point is that depending on the fin that you're seeing, you can sometimes identify the shark. I actually have a shark ID key here. If you do want to take a look at it afterwards, it shows what some of their fins look like. So when you see the fins in the water, it's not necessarily always a white shark that you're seeing. Here you have the, yeah, but you think it is, exactly. So there's the white shark has a very pointed dorsal fin, but if you see a basking, which often will also be on the surface because it's filter feeding, it'll have a very rounded dorsal fin. And then this is not a shark. These are porpoises. Probably a lot of you know that, but it's very easy to mistake them, especially when you see something in the distance and you're like, oh, a fin, I saw it. Like, what is that? It's a shark. It's not always. It can be a lot of different things too. So it's good not to jump to conclusions. So a bit more about their sharks' unique traits. So these are things that are almost exclusive to sharks. I mean, not always, but these are some of the things that make them interesting to me, at least. The first one is the electroreception. So that's what I mentioned earlier. And you can really clearly see this on this mako shark that was caught by DFO. So at the time, they were called the Canadian Shark Research Lab. And you can see all of these tiny dots are actually gel-filled pores. And so that can pick up electricity and help them to sense the prey that's around them. The other major feature of sharks is they have a cartilaginous skeleton. So they don't have bony structures like we do. They have cartilage just like your ear or your nose would. And that allows them to be more flexible as well. Some sharks, like the lemon sharks, especially when, or actually a better example is the nurse sharks when they're juveniles. If they get scared, they'll often like end up biting onto their own tail fin by accident, just because they're like nervous and bitey. And so they actually can turn around 360 and end up being in a fully circular position just because of how flexible they are. Another interesting thing about sharks is they have oil-rich livers. So where fish have swim bladders to control their buoyancy, sharks don't have that ability as much. And so they have really oily livers. Sometimes they're as large as 25% of their total body mass. And if they stop swimming, they'll sink to the bottom. That's why some species have developed buccal pumping. So the ones where they're either having to wait for their prey or they're searching for things on the bottom and they're not necessarily swimming all the time. They'll actually be able to sit on the bottom and force water over their gills to be able to breathe. Otherwise, they have to constantly swim in order to go up and down in the water column, or else they'll just start like sinking. Sharks also have a very specific diet. It may seem like sharks will eat anything that they can find, but they're actually quite picky, depending on the species especially. It will change with age as well. As the shark gets larger, will eat larger prey, which we might expect. But the sharks will be as particular as looking for one specific species of fish to eat. The lemon sharks that I was talking about before, they really only feed on yellowfin mohara. Even if there's a bunch of other prey available to them, they'll selectively choose that species. The other thing that's really interesting about sharks is their exceptional reproductive diversity. So different species have different modes of reproduction. All sharks are internally fertilized, so different from fish where they're spawning into the water column. And the females actually possess 2 uterus. And so that actually allows for some species to have like one uterus will have a like growing young in it, and then the other one can still be fertilized, or they can store the sperm to be able to have pups later on. So some species are able to have like a continuous cycle of reproduction. So there's not as much of like a break between pupping, and in that way they're able to have much higher fecundity, which is the number of sharks born per year, number of pups that they have per year. There's different ways that the babies will develop as well. So we have what's called oviparity or egg-laying sharks or rays. That's where what you'll see here with the quote-unquote mermaid purses. Here you can see the juvenile shark is growing in there, and there's a yolk that is kind of attached to in that egg. You will actually, I don't know if I've never seen one in Nova Scotia, but it's possible that you could see a skate egg case as well. And so you'll see these like really long strings. And inside of there, I mean, usually they're empty if you do find them on the beach, but there's some projects where they have people submit their egg casing sightings, and that can help to track different species and where they're giving birth. Another reproductive strategy is ovoviviparity. So that means the young are in eggs, but those eggs hatch inside the mother, and then they give birth to those young. And that's different from viviparity, where you have live birth with the placental-like nourishment, so similar to humans in a way, and that's where you have that umbilical cord-esque attachment that I was showing earlier, and where they might end up having umbilical scars. There's a huge range in the amount of pups that are born per each shark as well. In a whale shark, they can sometimes only have 1 to 2 pups, despite being such large sharks. You'd think they'd be able to have more. And this got cut off, but they could have over 100 pups in some cases, depending on the species. Sand tiger has a really interesting reproductive strategy, which is where one of the young will get larger than the others or be born first, and it'll actually cannibalize its siblings. This is really neat. But here's a diagram kind of exhibiting that. This is also showing how there's the 2 uterus, and some of the juveniles or the pups will actually be able to move from one to the other. So they can actually track across from one uterus to the other to eat all of the pups. There's other species where the one pup will eat the other eggs before they're developed, but in this one, it's actually the pups will be growing in the other, and they'll actually fight against each other. This is a really great strategy in a way, because then you end up with the fittest is the one that's born, and that shark is already much larger than some other sharks would be when they're first born, and so they have a really great chance at survival. Unfortunately, sharks and rays are at risk, primarily due to their interaction with fisheries, especially bycatch. Bycatch is a huge killer of sharks. There's a lot of targeted fisheries for sharks as well, but the bycatch, in cases of bycatch, when sharks do get caught, stress can also kill sharks. So if they have a long enough period where they're even caught on a hook, even if they're released at a later date, they can still perish. Critical habitat, as I spoke extensively on in the first presentation, is also important to designate to try to reduce the risk for sharks, because they use certain habitats for certain life stages. And so, for example, if there is a nursery and that nursery is destroyed, then the females are going to keep coming back to that nursery because that's what they're used to, even if it's already degraded. And so that would really reduce the population that survives into future and their overall population numbers. It's also important to determine their residency and behaviors in that case, to know where they are moving and what kind of habitat that they're using in order to try to minimize their interaction with the fisheries that aren't even meaning to catch them, but they just get caught on the line. Here's just a diagram showing extinction risk for shark species globally. On the left is a picture showing the change in red list index over time. So 1 being no change or largest amount of change, and then the lower you go is the lower less change, I believe. Sorry, scratch that. The 1 is if where it started, and then going down is the value that it's at. So those are indicators of what risk it was at in the beginning. So 1 would be least concern versus 0.4 would be closer to endangered. So sharks, if we look over time from 1980 to 2018, they have one of the steepest declines of any group of animals, other than the soft corals, which often exist like in the deep sea, where we know that there's a lot of deep sea development as well. If we look on this diagram where it's showing the classification on the IUCN Red List for different species, we can follow the path to see how that's changed over time. Here we have a lot of least concern species, so species we don't expect to go extinct, moving to vulnerable by 2005 and then endangered by 2018. And overall, we have a lot more vulnerable, endangered, and critically endangered species as time goes on. So what are we doing to try to understand more about sharks and how we can protect them and their critical habitat areas? There's a lot of shark research happening right now globally, and it's definitely increased in the past few decades with the Shark Week and all of the sharks in the media. It makes people a lot more interested in them. But there's a few main research areas that people are looking at. The first is their ecology and their behavior. That's their movement and habitat use, so similar to the studies happening in Bimini with those tags. It's also really important to research into their life history and demographics. So how fast are the sharks growing? At what age can they first pup or have pups? Fecundity, so how many pups are they having? And how long is their reproductive cycle? And how long does it take them to have those pups? That'll all impact their fisheries assessments. So there are shark fisheries globally. Like some sharks have very high growth rates, they have low age at maturity, they're high populations, and so you can have a shark fishery that can be managed properly. But you really need to have this information in order to know how many sharks you can catch sustainably. There's also a lot of research going into their current threats and their conservation, how much bycatch is happening, where fishing is occurring for sharks, and the global trade of sharks is also really critical to know where the sharks are being caught, what markets are buying them, and where they're moving. Physiology and sensory biology is another aspect of shark research ongoing. That's looking into their electroreception. So even the impact of underwater cables, when those are laid down, they give out some electrical signals. And so how is that impacting the shark's movement? Vision and noise, also from, like there's some studies looking at the impacts of the coastline of Miami being so many lights and so much noise and boating activity and how that impacts sharks based on what they're hearing. And if that's blocking out potential prey noise and if that's decreasing their ability to hunt. And then other research looks into their overall ecosystem role and interactions. So that's a huge field, especially looking at the stomach contents of sharks, what they're eating and how they fit into the overall food web. And all of these kind of together help to create a bigger picture of how sharks work in our environment, how sharks and rays are being, like how they're more at risk over time, and hopefully helping to increase their protections, but also sustainable use, because it's possible that they will be used and caught over time. Here on the right, I have the diagrams for how they age a shark. So this circular piece is the vertebral column of a shark. This is one way they age them. There are new techniques, but as I said, I can't go over everything. But this is one way. So if you look at the vertebrae, you can actually see rings. This is similar to a tree, how it has rings over time. So you can actually count them to be able to estimate how old the shark is at the time of capture. This is a cross section of that vertebrae. So you can see the rings still pretty faintly within that. But it would have started, the vertebrae would have been this size when it was first born, and then it gets larger and larger as it grows, of course. This is an example of a behavioral study. This was a really interesting one that happened in Bimini, where they actually created these semi-captive pens, and they watched the interactions of certain individual sharks with each other. And they found that lemon sharks actually like to spend time with each other more than they do with any other type of shark. And they'll have specific individuals that they form groups with and associations, and they actually want to spend more time with them than with other individuals. So I'll talk a bit more about their habitat use and that kind of research, because that's what I've been most involved in. This is a white shark with a satellite tag affixed to it, but I'll talk more on that in a second. And I think this should play on that. So this is a shark workup being completed by the Bimini Shark Club. They've captured this lemon shark. This is an adult female. And they're holding it by these ropes. Oops. I think I clicked down by accident. Sorry, can you click on that one again? I think it's now blocked a little bit. Thanks, sorry, just pressed the wrong button. Yeah, so here is, you can see there's a rope that they've tied around her front fins, a rope around the back tail fin, and that this person is holding the shark while they're inserting that tag. So that's a small tag. This is a casing tag, so I actually have one of them here. And this is just a tag that has a camera identification on it. The benefit of these is that anyone that catches a shark can then read that number and report to someone that they've caught it, that individual. And that's just inserted into the dorsal of the shark. This person's drawing blood to be able to look at the age of the shark. That's one aging technique. You can also learn something about their diet from that blood by looking at the isotopes in there. And then now they're just releasing the shark after they've collected the data that they need. So those shark workups, we usually try to do it very quickly, because the longer the shark is caught, the more stressed it is. Some species stress out faster than others. Hammerheads, for example, are very easily stressed, and so you want to release them within like 5 minutes of catching them. So when you're putting multiple tags on one individual, it can be quite rushed and like very quick, and you get very efficient at getting it all done as fast as possible. So this is the dart tag that I was just showing you that will be inserted into the dorsal fin. You can kind of see this one off the back of the shark. Another type of tag is the acoustic tag. So in Bimini, they've tagged a lot of different species. Acoustic tags are not solely for sharks, but you can attach them on anything in theory. The green turtles, for example, you wouldn't insert the tag, you would actually just tape it to their, or glue it to their shells. In the sharks, you make a small incision, and in the shark anatomy, they actually have a body cavity where you can insert a tag and it will kind of just sit in there, and it doesn't necessarily interact or disturb the shark at all. They've tagged and recaught sharks many times and haven't found many impacts of that type of tagging. And so once they have that tag, it actually sends out a pinging sound, and it would be picked up by a receiver. So this is one of a receiver that you might see. This is an older version, but this part will pick up acoustic signals. So if the shark swims within a certain range of this, so usually within like 50 to 100 meters, it would be picked up, and then you as a researcher would go and actually physically get this at the end of a field season and see what sharks were recorded on the device. Yeah, so these are the locations that we have in Bimini for those acoustic receivers. But maybe I'll look at that in a bit. The big benefit of those is that you can then have your tag picked up by other acoustic receivers that other people also place. And there's an international network that picks up on everybody else's tags. And so you get that shared data and that really long range movement. Another method of tracking is visual identification. So similar to the whale sharks, you can also identify patterns on the ventral side of hammerheads. And you can do this for white sharks as well, although it's harder to get underneath a white shark versus the hammerheads where I was showing you the site. They actually swim right over your head, so you can see that more clearly. Satellite tags is another method that's used quite commonly. And what this does is it actually tracks the entire movement of the shark, and that's sent to a satellite, as you might expect. That satellite will then transmit the data to the researcher. So there's no need to actually go and physically get any equipment after the tracking is completed. So that's really useful for that long range movement where you might not have the acoustic receivers. The one drawback is that they don't have as much battery life. So that's the real thing you're fighting against with a lot of these tags, is how long they'll actually run for. So here's what we found with the acoustic telemetry. There's a lot of overlap and usage of bull sharks and hammerheads off this side of Bimini, whereas the lemon sharks are using that lagoon area that I was talking about before. And this is the larger size classes, so not the juveniles, the ones that are getting up to a meter or more. And then the blacktip sharks are really specifically using certain areas of Bimini, possibly because of the presence of different channels. Here's some more data that we got from like acoustic arrays that were available to us from international collaborations. And here's some data that was from a satellite tagged tiger shark. So we can see the tiger shark moves from one area quite far off the coast of Nova Scotia, and then all the way back down to Bimini. So this dashed line is where we have no data, but we can take the data that we got from the satellite tags to kind of piece together their overall movement. And then here's the tracks that we were also able to get from a different shark. And again, we saw that they returned to Bimini because even though the satellite tag ran out of battery at this point, it was picked up on one of the acoustic receivers. And here's what's really special about Bimini is we've found that it's a pupping ground. So not a nursery because the sharks don't stay there, but the mothers come back to give birth. So this is actually shark ultrasound. So this is the mouth of the shark. It's opening, and this is its nose. Shark ultrasounds for like aquatic ultrasounds are not very new, but they're still fairly new, and they're being used more and more to determine whether a shark is pregnant or not, and to define pupping areas. Yeah, you can see she's quite large at this point. Like that's quite round for a shark, or for a tiger shark. And she's in those really shallow, warm waters where she knows that if she gives birth to her young, they'll be able to survive and not be predated on as much as they would be in the deeper Gulf Stream, for example. And here's some examples of some local tracking efforts. So this is actually a course that's run at Dalhousie University. They have a seaside course that they run every year. They now have 2 iterations of it running because it's so popular. And in that course, they'll catch the blue sharks, and because they have the capacity for it, they actually have this foam board that they put the sharks on. And when you turn a shark upside down, it goes into something called tonic. So it's kind of in a state of immobility, and it's almost knocked out in a way where it's not as reacting as much to touch. So when it's in that state, here's I find they're so cute. There's this little nose and his little fins. And we actually put a hose in their mouth. So they're getting continuous water flow over their gills to make sure they're still getting air. And then one researcher will do the surgery. So this isn't blood, this is betadine. It's a type of antiseptic. So we'll put that on the area. You make a small incision, like just small enough for the tag to fit into. And then you'll push the tag into the body cavity, and you stitch it back up similar to sutures that you would do like on a human. They actually have shark surgery and tagging courses at the University of PEI, which is something you might not have thought exists, but it's just for instances like this. And that's me. And then these are all of our students, and it's a huge learning opportunity for these students and a really unique opportunity for them, even globally. There's hardly any classes that exist like that where you can actually go and see this happening and see a shark in person. So the results of these efforts have meant that we now know that there's a very high mortality rate with bycatch for these blue sharks, with some tagging efforts where they've looked at, I think it was acoustics, but essentially you can see the tag, it'll be pinging for a while, and then it just kind of stops transmitting. Or it'll go, they have tags that will measure the depth at which the shark is diving, and you kind of see them go really deep, and then they just sit in one spot. And so you know that they've experienced mortality after the bycatch. We also found with these tags that the blue sharks are really highly migratory. They'll even go as far as the African coast, and that the North Atlantic is actually a huge shared population. So they're really global sharks. And so that has a huge implication for management, where you want to manage a fishery or manage the catch or bycatch of these individuals. You have to make sure that you're managing it globally. You can't just manage it in Canada, or else it won't have an impact. They also found that the sharks will dive up to 400 meters in one day, and they'll make these really big vertical migrations where they're going 400 meters deep and then coming back up at night to feed. There's a few local shark research organizations too. There's one in the Tancook Islands, so really close to here. They've just opened in the last couple of years, and they're doing some white shark tagging right now, but they're hoping to have an outreach center at some point. DFO also does a lot of, well, not a lot, but they do a lot of shark research and some tagging. So primarily their research is looking at past data, fisheries data, and from the tags that they have to see the movement of those individuals, and also to work with international partners to try to come up and help with the development of regulations, especially with ICES, which is the International Council of Sciences. Sorry, I'm blanking on the name right now, but they're an international body that works especially in the Atlantic to regulate international fisheries. Some other research that's happening at Dalhousie right now is trying to unravel the global shark meat trade. That's with the Integrated Fisheries Lab. And so they have local people from India that are now in Dalhousie working on unraveling this trade and working with the local people on the ground to figure out what sharks they're catching, what the risks are even for the local people who are working in the shark fishing industry, and how the shark meat trade works internationally. And then there's another lab also at Dalhousie looking at shark movements. This isn't them, but they were working on whale shark tagging just this past spring, and they're trying to understand even the daily movements of these sharks and map that movement and see what their fisheries interactions are. And so that might help with where these fisheries are operating and trying to avoid these critical habitats for some of these species. And I think this is the last thing I'll leave you with, but the main thing I want to hope that you learn from this is that sharks are not man-hungry. They're really unique and specific animals that have specific diets too. The problem is that sharks often test their food before they eat it. And so most of the time, if there are bites, it's a case of mistaken identity. Also, one fun fact is that Jaws actually invented the term great white to make it sound more exciting. They're actually just called white sharks. But yeah, so you don't have to feel like if you're in the water, the shark's going to go and track you out and find you as soon as it hears splashing, or you have a cut on your ankle and it's going to smell this drop of blood from a million miles away. That's not actually how sharks work. Their sense of smell is not that good. And if they were trying to smell something out, they'd be looking for fish, if anything, or seal. They wouldn't be looking for human. But there's a few things that do increase your risk of potential shark attacks or shark actual mistaken bites. I don't necessarily like the word attack, but it's especially if you're swimming or surfing near seal colonies, that's near their prey. And if there's any instance where they can't see very well, if there's low water visibility, if you're in the water at dawn or dusk, that's when they're hunting more. If you're floating at the surface, that's going to all increase your risk because you just look more like a seal. And that's especially true for Nova Scotia. If you go to other areas, there's other types of sharks with different feeding behaviors. But at least for here, like if you avoid that, you're really going to be fine. And one of the things I wanted to show you, if we could play this video, that'd be great. If you click on that picture, it should show up. It's just about the more recent sighting of sharks. There were some divers, probably some of you heard of it. There were divers that saw a shark as they were scuba diving, and I really like their take on it. So we'll just go on that and see what they had to say about it. So if you scroll down, I think the video is just down there. Did anyone have questions while we were waiting for the video to come up?
Has there been any attacks in Nova Scotia?
What's that?
Shark attacks in Nova Scotia?
Has there been any? Not that there was one person up in Cape Breton, but they were really close to some seal colonies and they were in a wetsuit and on the surface. Of course, I'm not blaming any of the victims. They just didn't know, but.
You just saw these.
Yeah, that's the only one that I've heard of. Otherwise.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, just don't extend past the licenses you already have. You're not even using what you have.
Some more like smaller individuals, like around in the summer
Big
when the
black
water's
eyes
warmer.
and this Cheshire.
But for the most part, they're not really coming right up close to beaches where people would be anyway. So.
Their grin and this face was just
kind of coming up out of the water at us and just slowly looking at us and really curious about a 12-foot great white shark. That's a shark. So we were at Fox Point Beach, which is just right over there, and it was I was taking a guided dive with a retired U.S. airman, and we were just out on our second dive. About 15 minutes in, it just kind of came up out of the murk.
We're swimming along. All of a sudden, Eric pulls me by my strap there, and he points, and I look, and there was this amazing creature. It was just beautiful. At the same time, it's like, that's a shark. What the heck was going through my head is, we got to get out of here.
He was signaling that we should go up, and that's the last thing you want to do because the surface is actually where most like shark encounters actually happen. That's the natural environment for predation. So the best thing to do is stay on the bottom. So I told him to stay, and I took a hold of his harness, and we just sat on the bottom on our knees and just let the shark come up and sniff us. Came straight up to us, like playing a game of chicken.
He wasn't attacking us or in any way, shape, or form. He was just like scoping them out. And he had a bunch of his other little fishy buddies with him as well. And they're just along for the cruise and like circle and circle and just keep going, keep going. Eric was the man as far as, just guiding us back. As we're going back, like this shark, he kept on circling around. And I said, okay. So I turned myself around and hooked myself into Eric. And so now, like, Eric is looking this way, I'm looking that way, and like, if this shark's going to come from any angle, we got it.
This was a juvenile, so we believe that the shark was just curious. Probably never saw divers before and just wanted to know what we were. There was no signs of aggression.
If he wanted us, he could have had us, either way. But he was just like circling around, just meeting up with some people, just being curious. A lot of these creatures in the sea are just curious.
I mean, the dive site we were at, that's where we teach, and we must have been there 1,000 times, and no one's ever seen a great white before. So the rest of the shop is burning with envy right now.
I get shivers and I get up and down my spine. It's like, whoa, it's an experience, a once in a lifetime, hopefully once in a lifetime experience that, I share it with my kids, my friends, family, everywhere. It just, they ask me about it, they talk to me about it, and I still get this little buzz.
It's a dream come true. I think we're talking about getting some great white tattoos now.
Yeah, so you can see that even if you're in the water with the shark and it's right there and it's looking at you, and you're essentially totally vulnerable. If it wanted to, it really could just come up and bite you, but it doesn't want to. It's just looking at you. You don't look like a seal, you're on the bottom. It's really not interested in you at all, except for just curiosity. Obviously still a very harrowing experience, seeing something that large. But really, if you did see one in the wild, you would just be amazed by like how calm and beautiful they are in their own environment. And I, for one, am excited that there's so much buzz around them recently, because I think they're going to get more attention. And hopefully there's more research dollars that go into learning how to protect them as well. So you might think there's not much that you can do to help sharks, but there are a few things. One of them is just to watch. Something that's kind of strange is there are a lot of sharks in cosmetics. And so if you see squalene or squalane on your cosmetics, that's possibly shark oil that's in the cosmetics as well. There's some fish liver oils that will also be from shark. This is often from the byproduct of shark fishing, but there is actually a huge market for shark oils. As I was talking about, they have those huge fatty livers. So you can try to avoid or boycott products that have that. There is a vegan squalene or squalane also, but they'll usually label if it's vegan. If you try to consume food that's responsibly caught, seafood that's responsibly caught, the biggest one is tuna. They will get caught in the long line fishing, but there are ways to mitigate that risk, and there are companies that will responsibly try to mitigate that risk. Travel responsibly, based on that previous presentation, try to look for some eco-tourist destinations as much as possible. And if you want to donate, there's some really great shark organizations out there that always need more support. Yeah, and generally tell your friends and family about sharks and that they're not these scary monsters, and there's a lot to learn about them. And yeah, I hope that I taught you something new and you have a fun fact to bring home with you at the end of the day. Yeah, that's all. Okay, I'll go left to right.
Heard that sharks are sealed by the smell. Is that, do they have a sense of smell, and how big a range can they smell their prey?
So the question was that sharks could potentially smell seals and at what range that is, and if they could smell their prey. They do have an olfactory sense, but it's actually not their best sense. Their best sense is the electroreception. And I'm not sure exactly what the distance is that they can smell seals at, but it's not the same. Like, I think there's a myth that goes around about like a drop of blood in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. That's not accurate. They wouldn't be able to smell that in such a large area. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. So they do smell, but not as large of a range as you would think. Yeah.
Emily, you've expressed a great admiration for sharks.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, if you were swimming and a shark came close to you, would you have any fear?
If I was snorkeling, if I was on the surface, definitely. At that point, it's like get to the shore as soon as possible, because they could potentially think I was a seal. If I was in the water, like diving with them, I don't think I'd have any fear at all. I think I would I would be scared because it's a huge animal, and often it's when the visibility is low, so they'll kind of sneak up on you in a way because they're kind of hiding in that murk. But at least for me personally, I wouldn't be afraid. Like, I think in that circumstance, like after they saw that shark at that dive site, I was like, oh, I really want to go. Like, I got to go and see the shark. But as a responsible person, I didn't go, because if something does happen, then the shark is going to be the one that's vindicated for it, even if there's a really, really low chance of that happening. I didn't want to risk it. So, but yes, I hope that answers your question. And the question was whether or not if I was swimming, if I would have been scared of the shark. Yeah.
Of the down the shore, I think around the Liverpool area, there's a tourist attraction that has a shark cage.
Right.
That bait shark to come in, so people can wonder. And I'm just wondering what your opinion on that is.
So the question is if I have an opinion or what my opinion is on the shark tourism that's happening with the cage diving. I think it's probably better for us to talk about that afterwards. I don't think that I don't know enough to vindicate anything. I think that the main thing with shark tourism is that you have to know if the data is being used in some way for real shark research and being put to policy, and if the sharks are being responsibly managed. Yeah, in terms of, I think there's some controversy for baiting the sharks and that potentially attracting them closer to the shore into people. There's been a lot of studies, and I can comment on that a bit. There's been a lot of studies on other baiting, cage diving in South Africa, for example. They're always baiting their sharks. It's not just, like, you'll see pictures of the sharks like slamming into the cages. It's really, those are the most irresponsible people because they're actually dragging the bait quickly towards the cage so that the shark will essentially ram into it to make it seem like it's more of a harrowing experience. They're not doing that here. That would be just totally blown out of the water. Like, no one would stand for that. But they have shown that it's not necessarily true that the sharks will then be attracted to every boat. But there are other cases where the sharks might be more attracted to boats because of baiting. However, the sharks would also be attracted to boats that are fishing because if there's fishing activity ongoing. So I don't think that it would increase the interaction between sharks and humans or sharks coming closer to shore, because the reason there is cage diving is because they're already there. Otherwise, they wouldn't even bother trying to look for them if they weren't present. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Oh, yeah. When we went out for the tagging course with Dalhousie, every time I've gone out with them, I've seen at least one. But otherwise, I'm not really out offshore very often now where I work. But yeah, when you do go out, you do see them quite often. They're really spectacular. Have you seen them before? Or?
I've seen one.
Oh my goodness. Oh, really? Yeah, they're huge. Yeah, they're like really interesting. I don't know if you should look up what a sunfish looks like afterwards. And I forgot to repeat the question again, but the question was whether I'd seen a sunfish in my research in Nova Scotia. And yeah, you should really look up a picture of a sunfish because they almost look like they shouldn't be able to swim with how weirdly shaped they are, but they've somehow evolved and have survived for thousands of years. So they're really fascinating. Yeah. In what way? Oh, okay. Well, so the question was if I could expand on the sense of electroreception. I think it would be probably easier for me to explain with some more diagrams, which I don't have, unfortunately. But generally, it's that they have these jelly-filled pores that are, like, the jelly is conductive, so it picks up the electrical signal. So everything that is alive has some kind of electrical signal because there's electrons that are moving when your heart beats, when blood's moving through your system. It's generating a very small electrical field. And so the stingrays that are hiding under the bottom of the sand, they're generating those electric fields. So even though you can't see them, those small pores that are electrically sensitive, they have nerve endings that are attached to them and that are then connected to the shark's brain. It's able to, like, sense and feel those fields. So almost similar to, well, I don't know what they feel exactly, can't ask them, but I would imagine it'd be similar to like a static charge where if you're rubbing a balloon, you kind of feel the like electricity over the balloon after. It'd be similar to that where it's like all of a sudden it's getting a sense of electricity moving somewhere and then it can say, oh, that must be a stingray that's hiding under the sand. Yeah, hope that explains it a bit better. Yeah.
Okay, well, I
think we are videoing, so we do have a bit of a time restraint here, but I'd like to really thank you, Emily. This has been a really informative and interesting subject. And I think we've all learned a little bit more about sharks than we knew before. So thank you so much for coming. And
Thanks for having me. Okay. Yeah, if you want to come up and see things.